Okay, welcome to this evening session at the Russia War Crimes House. I think I've been here 3 times today now for the opening, for a fascinating session with a lot of the people who were on the panel today. And now for this session, which I think we're planning to direct on the question of, well, these war crimes have happened. How do you bring people to justice? Is that possible? What would an international tribunal look like? How can you get it off the ground? We will, I think, at some point be joined by Tim Snyder, the great historian of Ukraine. I think he's on his way. But I will quickly get everyone on the panel to introduce themselves, and then I'll start with a view from a veteran diplomat, Wolfgang Ischinger, who will have a sense of what's needed to get crimes to court and the international politics involved. But let me just, is there why don't we just pass the microphone down the line and everybody can say who they are. So Wolfgang, why don't you start?
Can I give you one more?
Okay, perfect.
Okay. Well, thank you, Gideon, and thanks for having me here tonight. I haven't yet had a chance to see the exhibition in its totality, but I'm delighted to be here. I've been marginally involved in the attempt to get this house out of Russian hands into Ukrainian hands, and I'm delighted to see that this actually worked. I want to congratulate Victor and his entire team for overcoming all sorts of small and larger difficulties in making this happen in such a short period of time. So that's the first point I wanted to make. My second point.
Wolfgang, before I get you onto the substance, let's just quickly say, introduce the panel, and then we'll get onto the substance. Could I just?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No worries.
Yeah.
That's fine.
So I'm Wolfgang Ischinger from the Munich Security Conference. That's all I wanted to say.
And also former diplomat, ambassador to Washington, to London, and many places.
Okay, I'll keep this brief. I'm Lesya Vasilenko. I'm a member of Parliament of Ukraine. I'm a member of the PACE delegation of Ukraine, Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and I'm also the president of the Women's Bureau at the Inter-Parliamentary Union.
Oh, sorry. That's impressive. I'm Roxolana Pedlasa. I'm member of the Parliament and deputy chair of Economic Development Committee.
My name is Helena Mikhailuk. I'm also a member of the Parliament Presidential Majority. I'm deputy head of the Law Enforcement Committee and representative of Ukrainian Parliament to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly.
Okay, the last not least. My name is Elena Sotnik. I'm a human rights defender, former member of the Parliament, and in my capacity now advisor to the Vice Prime Minister on Euro integration.
Perfect, thanks. Okay, we might as well have that
okay,
one.
I will.
So, Wolfgang, to get to the substance of it, we see around us some of the horrifying evidence of war crimes committed in Ukraine. Part of what needs to be done is to gather evidence, but that's not all. I mean, how do you get from the evidence to actually having war crimes trials, and how likely do you think that is ever to happen?
Well, first of all, I mean, the nature of this war is different from previous wars. When I think of the wars in former Yugoslavia, we did not have the capacity at that time, in the early or mid 90s, to collect evidence in the way that it is now, that it has now become possible. I've seen these brief videos of people who are either shooting people or at least taking them away, taken by simple, observation. I mean, cameras, etc. In other words, there is now going to be a huge amount of data available, and the only question is how to collect it as meticulously, as carefully as possible. In other words, I think this is a whole new world, and finding evidence and presenting it will be a lot less difficult than was the case in previous conflicts. First point. Second point, everybody knows, I suppose, that Russia has not ratified, is not a member of the existing tribunal in The Hague. But leaving aside the question, and I really don't know the answer to that, whether it is possible to construct a truly international tribunal which would be somehow mandated by the UN against firm opposition by the Russian Federation. Leaving aside that question for a moment, there are of course huge opportunities at the national and at the international level. Don't forget that recently a local German court convicted some perpetrators from the Sudanese conflict, and they're going to jail. These people had fled to Europe and were arrested. And in other words, justice, meting out justice, is possible for these types of war crimes, even in the absence of a working, fully internationalized and mandated tribunal. There are national ways. We've all been reading about the first war crimes trial in Ukraine, which is also totally okay. There comes Professor Snyder, whom we welcome. So I think there is no reason to believe that this is not possible. There will be, I'm sure there will be attempts in other European countries, including my own country. There may be attempts in the United Kingdom. Maybe the European Union can find some way of getting organized in order to help take these issues forward. But my last point is this, and I speak as a, how shall I put it, as a former practicing diplomat. First things first, I'm very, very much in favor of making sure that every little bit of evidence is now being collected and meticulously, registered and stored so that it can be found and used for future indictments and court proceedings. But then I have a problem when people, and I hope that doesn't provoke too much opposition in this room here, I have a problem when people shout at me and say, the first thing that should now happen is that Sergei Lavrov and Vladimir Putin should be taken to some tribunal, should be convicted, and should end up in jail. I want to just make all of you aware that if we had applied this principle in 94, 95, when the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia had already been created, if we had applied that principle fully, maybe President Milosevic would have been arrested and taken to The Hague and convicted, and then we would not have had a Slobodan Milosevic to negotiate a peace treaty with the rest of the world in Dayton, Ohio. In other words, without him, Dayton, Ohio would not have happened. So let's make sure that we know what we're doing here. Let's make sure that we know that if and when Ukraine wishes to conduct serious discussions about peace or a ceasefire, that there is a partner with whom one can reasonably negotiate. The only partner at this moment, whether we like it or not, is the leadership of the Russian Federation. So in other words, my simple point is, first things first. Let's take these people to jail once the war is ended, but not before, because we may actually need them to end the war.
But
That's my point.
I'll turn to Tim in a second, but an obvious objection, it strikes me, is one of their conditions in any peace settlement is no war crimes tribunal, I assume. They're not going to agree to that.
Well, that is, of course, something which they can write into a piece of paper which they sign with Ukraine. Will that bind the United States? Will that bind Germany? Will that bind other countries in the West? I don't think so. So really, I think my point stands. Even if we cannot have an international war crimes tribunal for this particular purpose, because Russia refuses to endorse such a thing for obvious reasons, there are many, many different ways of convicting, of prosecuting, indicting, and eventually convicting people for war crimes by national tribunals. Again, I repeat, it is now okay under international law. I have not heard a single professor or a single institution saying that it is not okay for the German court in the city of Koblenz to indict and prosecute and send a senior Sudanese person to jail. So voila, we have the president, the legal president, and that is not only possible for Germany, that's possible for every other country, even if we may not end up having a meaningful internationally mandated tribunal.
Okay, thanks very much, and you've raised a lot of points which will keep us going this evening. Tim, welcome. You probably got most of what Wolfgang had to say, but to summarize, it was some wariness or skepticism about how easy it would be to set up an international tribunal, but offering the routes of domestic courts prosecutions. Also pointing out how much evidence, how much easier it is to collect evidence now than it was even in the 1990s. And then that last exchange you will have heard about whether you go for the small fish or whether you go for Putin and Lavrov, how you do this. What's your views?
I mean, first of all, I'm very glad to be here, and I'm looking forward to learning from colleagues from Ukraine who actually have expertise on these questions and have been directly involved. I'm a historian from another country, and what I will have to say is pretty general on these subjects. The first thing that I think is important is to keep the thinking as broad as possible about how and what we might be prosecuting in the future. So across the spectrum of war crimes, aggressive war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, I'm all in favor of at least thinking very big. In particular, I think all four of those have been met, and for me, it's quite important to have genocide be a subject of discussion, because after all, there is a body of law about it, and all five of the criteria in Section 2 have been met. And that is to say, the Russian occupying forces have committed all five crimes, each of which severally constitutes genocide. The only possible question would be the intentionality around it. And scholars of genocide have, quite, I think, convincingly shown that when you talk about a nation not existing, that's a declaration of your intention to destroy it. And Mr. Putin has repeatedly and serially talked about the non-existence of the Ukrainian nation. And so you have, and then within RIA Novosti and other very central Russian media, you have these open declarations of intent to make Ukraine no longer exist. And we know that what both denazification and decommunization actually mean de-Ukrainization. I mean, the Russian discourse about this is actually, I find as a historian of genocide, it's actually unusual for the discourse of genocide to be this clear while it's happening. I mean, usually the perpetrators do a better job of trying to dissuade people from the notion that what they're doing is committing genocide. It's almost as though Russian authorities are advertising that this is their intention. So my first main observation is that I think we have to be keeping all four of those on the table, and that genocide is particularly important because whether or not we end up being able to prosecute it in some forum, which is a question I have to leave to people who know better than me, it helps to define usefully what's going on, also for people inside the Russian Federation, also for the people who will be making judgments about these events later on. So that's where I'll start, Gideon.
Just a quick follow-up, and then we'll turn to our colleagues from Ukraine. But this whole use of the term genocide, I understand that there's a lot of legal definitions out there, but I think to the public it's still a bit confusing. So that when the Chinese are accused of genocide in Uyghur, against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, people say, well, what they're doing is terrible, but it's not mass murder. And I think people think of genocide as mass murder. Why is it still the right term here?
So that I think precisely that's a wonderful question, because I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine is actually such a textbook example of genocide that it gives us a chance to clarify what the legal definition actually is. So as a historian in my historical work, I never use the word genocide for the reason that you've just given, which is that there are two definitions at work in the popular mind. In the popular mind, some genocide can mean trying to kill every single person, which is a very high standard, right? Met, perhaps once, but not very many times in history. But then there is the actual legal definition of genocide, which was created with the Holocaust in mind, but not only the Holocaust, also the Armenian genocide, also the Holodomor. And the legal definition of genocide is very interesting because it has to do with the attempt to destroy, in whole or in part, a people. Right? And that attempt can take, as we know from history, that attempt can take various forms. It need not be the literal, mechanized, physical murder of every single person. It can also include things like taking children away from their parents and educating them in a different culture, which applies, for example, to Canadian treatment of Native peoples, but also applies to the deportation of Ukrainian children far away into Russia with the hope that they will simply assimilate. I mean, so if one looks at Russian deportation of Ukrainian citizens, these are disproportionately women and children, and they're being spread all around Russia with the very clear intention, it seems to me, of treating them as human raw material who will assimilate or whose children will be assimilated. That is actually genocidal intent according to the law. So there are also things which are quite clearly dramatic, like mass rape, where where genocidal language is used around the crime itself, or the murder of civilians, where genocidal language is used around the crime itself. But what's striking to me is that here we have a head of state who personally has said multiple times this nation doesn't exist, and whose major press services, not to mention television, I mean, I don't know how many of you are following Russian television, but proclamations of genocidal intent are just found very fast and thick on Russian television all the time. But on the official news service, RIA Novosti, there have been at least two texts, one right after the war began and one a few weeks ago, which made it quite clear that what was meant by denazification is actually the destruction of the Ukrainian nation. So I think this is actually a clarifying opportunity for us to talk about how horrible it is to aspire to destroy a nation, even though that can take various kinds of forms. I mean, the reason why, sadly and horribly, the Russian example is so instructive is that they're doing all of them at the same time. They're doing the separation of children, they're doing the deportation, they're doing the murder, right? I mean, pretty much everything that you can do according to the Genocide Convention of 1948, they're doing at the same time.
Okay, Tim and Wolfgang, thank you very much. Now, as Tim said, you guys are in the thick of it and having to think about this as well as about the war that's all around you. So I'd just be interested in your reactions to what you've heard. Are you encouraged? Do you feel after listening to all this that there's more likely to be some kind of justice, or are you discouraged? Helena, do you want to start?
Well, actually, I'm a representative of the Law Enforcement Committee, so the whole package of legislation will go through my committee. That should be adopted we have already started from the draft law on cooperation with International Criminal Court. And I should say that for law enforcement committees, highly important that each comma, each word will be agreed with our chief commander, Mr. Zaluzhny, so that soldiers will be comfortable with any piece of legislation that should be adopted. That means that Ukraine now survived 85 days of full-scale war because of the bravery of our soldiers. So we should make sure that any piece of legislation that will be adopted will not make them more vulnerable, so that, of course, their actions lead to some deaths, let's say, from Russian side, yeah. So we would like them to be secured from, this is the main actually condition of Mr. Zaluzhny, that any piece of legislation that will be adopted, the main, let's say, his idea is that Ukrainian soldiers can be prosecuted only in Ukrainian courts. Otherwise, any kind of other legislation will prevent them from such a bravery actions as they had till this moment. For law enforcement committee, also it is highly important to have face-to-face negotiations with ICC on what exactly piece of legislation needs to be adopted. That's why in June we go to Hague, to the ICC, negotiate exactly what kind of legislation should be adopted. And we also will go to our colleagues in Bundestag and Bundesrat, like in German parliament, so they could share their experience they used to have, because this is the only one country that had this Nuremberg tribunal. We don't want to sit in Kiev in our bulb and to have our own imagination on what pieces of legislation need to be adopted, but we would like it to be fully transparent and negotiate all the pros and cons. Currently, we've already established a working group, and we work on the package of legislation on military justice. We would like to empower military prosecutors' office, because they are the first one who will come to the deliberated territories, because there are some specialities that military prosecutors, they are trained in terms of demining procedures, how to collect evidences. These are not the policemen who will come and step first, and military soldiers, they have other job to do, basically. We already have a number of requests from European Union countries who would like to assist and would like to send their teams of prosecutors, because we realize that evidence should be collected very quickly. There are already more than 10,000 criminal cases opened in Ukraine, and we realize such a huge mass of work military prosecution team and all the law enforcement agencies in cooperation should do together. That's why we feel it very much responsible to do our best. Any amendments into legislation that will help our law enforcement agencies to do their job as soon as possible, and of course to have this tribunal established, we will do our best. And we do hope that we will succeed in this highly important mission for the committee. I'll be happy to answer any questions if you're interested in. And I think I will pass word to my colleagues in this regard.
I shall have a couple of remarks. I actually, speaking about the clear case of genocide, I think that it's important to note or to remind the thing that we talked today during the discussion, that for us it is clear who are the good guys are, but will it be as clear for the judges? Because for example, Bosnia and Herzegovina, they failed to present the case of genocide, and judges were not convinced. Even they acknowledged the mass murder, but they did not find the evidence convincing that it was intentional mass murder on the basis of the nation. On national characteristics. This is one case. It will be the task for Ukrainian lawyers to build this case as convincingly as possible. But I think that we're quite far from this question, because I'm personally concerned with the practical issues and the practical side of how we're going to establish this tribunal, because who's going to mandate it? It is quite obvious that the UN Security Council will veto, Russia in UN Security Council will veto it, and the UN will not mandate it. As they did with MH17, they did not allow us to establish international tribunal on that. What we did that, and I think that Taras Kachka, the participant of this case, could tell us more about that. But what Ukraine did is 5 countries that suffered from MH17. It's Ukraine, Canada, Malaysia, and so on. They handed over the jurisdiction to the Dutch criminal court to investigate this case and to prosecute this case. In this case, and this may be a solution for Ukraine, but we have to discuss who will be on board with that and who will have the jurisdiction over these cases. We have a good sign of 40 countries now joining us in the case Ukraine versus Russia, in the so-called genocide case already. So the coalition is quite clear, it is firm, and we understand that we will...
So what's the forum there, where the 40 countries have joined you?
It is a case in International Criminal Court, Court of Justice, sorry. We have the signs that we will have this coalition when it comes to establishing the tribunal, but the details, they matter and they are not clear at the moment. And I think that we shall discuss that as well.
I will carry on from this. I actually had the honor of being in a panel recently with the British historian Max Hastings, and he said the challenge for all armies in all ages is to cherish warrior virtues while rejecting warrior excesses. And actually, Russia is doing exactly the opposite. They are cherishing warrior excesses by committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, the crime of crimes, genocide, and the crime of aggression. All of these crimes under international law, they qualify differently, and they must be regarded by different judicial institutions. This is why when we talk about the International Criminal Court, which must regard one type of claims. When we're talking about the crime of aggression, the International Criminal Court has no jurisdiction over that. So this is why Ukraine is set on setting up a special tribunal against regard the case against Russian aggression. And when we're talking about the International Court of Justice, there are cases there already under consideration. The big question is, for not just for Ukraine and us Ukrainians, but for the international community, is how prepared are we to live with the plague of aggression in the world? How prepared and can we afford to live actually next to a disease-ridden nation, which today is Russia under Putin's rule, which is infecting the rest of the world with aggression, xenophobia, with the disease of the mind, which is spread by the propaganda which Putin is spreading all the time. And I think that the question is here demands a very clear answer, and that answer should be no every time that we ask those questions. We are not prepared to live in such a world. And this is where I turn to, again, to international law and the doctrine of state responsibilities, and that says very clearly. So the first step should be for the international illegal act to stop. That is the act of aggression. That must be stopped. And here we need a consolidated effort from the international community to help stop the act of Russia's aggression. We need weapons. We need financial aid for Ukraine. We need more sanctions and all the way in sanctions against Russia. And we need that to be going on for a little while longer at the moment. After the act of aggression is stopped, we cannot say that that's it, full stop, this is victory, because that's not how international responsibility of states work. In the draft articles on responsibility of states of 2001, it says clearly that after aggression is stopped or any illegal act is stopped by a state, there must be a guarantee of non-repetition, and that's state must give that guarantee. The only way to push for that guarantee and to make it real is to make the wrongdoer pay, to have reparations set in place. And the main question that we should be asking each other and the global community really is, how are we going to make Russia pay for all the crimes, all the damage, all the harm inflicted in Ukraine, but also all the damage and the losses caused to the allies of Ukraine, who have been very good in helping us with weapons, in helping us with introduction of sanctions, in financial aid, humanitarian aid, because all of these need to be accounted for as well. So there's something that Ukraine could be doing already at national level, and we are doing this. There's a draft law, which I think actually everyone in this panel and in this room who's a member of parliament co-signed. It's a draft law on a consolidated claim against Russia, meaning that an agency should be set up in Ukraine, the sole work of which should be to count the damage and the harms inflicted by Russia on Ukraine. That law is under consideration in parliamentary committees and hopefully will be in parliament soon. That will make the challenge of presenting the evidence and having a set number much easier. The second step is, of course, to consolidate international efforts around pushing for justice, for international justice, which is needed for the victims who have suffered directly from Russia's aggression and from Russia's war crimes, but also which is needed for the international community to be confident about reinstating international law as we know it today, about reinstating a belief in democracy and a belief in all the principles about which we so often talk in all the different panels. Once that is done, I think none of us have the illusion here that Russia will willingly come forward and say, okay, well, since there's a court ruling, that's it, we're going to pay out all the damage, whatever the sum of money you put at the end of the check. No, Russia's never going to do that, at least not under this leadership, and at least not if it's not reformed from the inside. So the challenge here is, what can we do? Well, first of all, I see that sanctions cannot be lifted unless and until Russia pays. This should be a clear baseline. Second is the fact that Russia can be made to pay with all the assets, with all the property that they have outside of Russia. But for that to be a reality, the countries that are our allies, that are our partners, sometimes will need to change their laws to allow in their national legislation to confiscate the assets and the property owned by Russia and to transfer it in the form of compensation and restitution for all of the damage caused in Ukraine. And finally, the doctrine of state immunities, that will have to be reviewed as well. Based on the principle that the states have immunities to protect their sovereignty, but not in any case to allow them to breach the sovereignty of other states. So that's some thoughts which I had from our discussion. Yes, sorry for taking some time, but yeah, thank you.
So we've got one more panelist here and another who's just joined us. I'll come to you at the end, but yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you. First of all, I'm going to elaborate very quickly, I think, on the main cornerstones of this process. First of all, I'm going to talk about Putin, of course, and how to bring him to justice, because I think each person who lost child or beloved or parents maybe in this war, they first of all expect this from the world. Second, of course, I'm going to talk about genocide. Third, it is about the responsibility of the army, soldiers, military people. And fourth, of course, compensations. And here I also have some solutions, maybe. But we need to start from the philosophy, which is very important. And mainly it is about the principle of impunity. It's very important to explain to the whole world, to the majority of people who don't care, and they still kissing on the benches, not far away from Ukraine and the place where the war, large-scale war now, and they don't care about the future justice. And we need to explain that impunity would be the biggest crime if it's going to happen. So any peaceful resolutions, they shouldn't follow with this impunity for the high-level authorities. And now I'm going to talk about the most difficult question. Do you expect Putin sitting on the bench in the court? Like physically? Let's be realistic. I don't think that it's going to happen, because it is absolutely different from Nuremberg process. We are living in nuclear age. And also, let's be fair, the main fear of the civilized countries, it is about nuclear war. And that's why we need to be realistic. And yes, we don't expect him sitting on the bench, but we expect that he is going to be in the court. And in this case, without special tribunal, without in absentia process, without also withdrawing state impunity, it would be impossible. And there is no scheme, there is no rules in the present judicial system, international judicial system, how to do this. That's why without special tribunal, setting up the special tribunal, it would be impossible to bring him to justice.
Sorry, I don't fully understand, because you seem to say at the one hand, it's not going to happen, and then
Not going to happen physically.
yeah,
He is not going to sit on the bench.
it can be tried in absentia.
Yes. I think that it is only one and the realistic way how to do this, at least on this stage. As far as many countries, let's be fair, in the world, they're really afraid of nuclear war. So, but it is very important to bring him to justice. And here, that's why I started from the impunity principle. It's very important to bring all the high-level officials of Russia to justice. And it would be possible only with special tribunal. And that work already started. It was the first draft was set up a week ago in Vilnius, I believe, and there is some structure of the special tribunal. It is possible to do this, and I'm sure that we will do this. Second question, genocide. So if we go to the, first of all, of course, definition of genocide, and then when we go deeply and analyze everything what's been told by Russians officials, I mean, Putin, his article, which Timothy just several months ago on YES conference been discussing, and other official statements which Putin made and officials made, it was everything about ignoring existence of Ukrainian nation. It was everything about destroying Ukrainian nation. And then when we go after this and we see what is happening on the ground, the evidences of this war, the main target, civilians. There are a lot of like millions, almost million of Ukrainians deported. It is this one more sign of genocide. Third question, of course, it is raping, massive raping, not just women, but young girls, and they are using raping as sexual violence as a weapon. Why they are doing this? First of all, they want Ukrainian women even to, like, you know, to ignore their nature, that they are women. Many of them, the outcome of this raping, they don't want to bring life to this world, you know? They don't want to be women, they don't want to be mothers. What is this? Of course it's genocide. And the last, and also very important, if you look to the main destructions and to the map of these destructions, it is everything about critical infrastructure. It is everything about destroying the infrastructure, just that it would be impossible to live in Ukraine for ordinary people. They are destroying water supply, they are destroying energy supply, heating, etc., etc. So it means that they are deliberately trying to destroy any preconditions for living for Ukrainians. And soon I can announce this because I am working with a different group and I am honored to work with different international lawyers now. Soon it will be report on genocide, first report of scholars from United States, I think in 1 week or two. So we will have grounds to discuss it. And the last one, about soldiers, very quickly. I think Ukraine doing this great job. It's very important to just proceed with evidences that it would be really legal evidences and verified and etc., etc. But today, and it's a very important moment, today it was first verdict in court. So it means that Ukraine already started this, and we demonstrate to the whole world that impunity is impossible. And the last one, compensations. I don't believe and I don't think that all existing measures, all existing schemes, they would be efficient in order to compensate all the losses which Ukraine has now. We are talking about different one. Personal, we are talking about the business which lost a lot, we are talking about state, we are talking about moral losses. And of course, it would take like years in international courts to get this money. So I would refer to Kuwait case when the special commission was set up. Yes, the problem is that it was set up in United Nations, and here we would have a problem because Russians, of course, would veto it. But it doesn't mean that we can't do the same like with International Tribunal. There is an opportunity. So now we have frozen assets. We need to arrest them. We need to seize them and put them into special fund of compensation. This is, like, of course, it sounds simple, but it's possible. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I realized I failed to do a basic job of a moderator, which is to work out how long we have. When are we meant to end, Thomas? Do you know? In 10 minutes, okay. Well, we have one more panelist who arrived towards the end. If you'd like to introduce yourself and comment briefly on what you've heard.
Yeah. Hello, everybody, and please feel free to stop me because briefly is a very relative concept right now. Yeah. We are horrible in time management. So my name is Ilona Shkrum. I'm a member of Parliament of Ukraine, and you know I do not know whether this is Chatham House or not, but I feel that my role here.
I think it's on YouTube actually. So
okay,
I'd say
well,
not.
anyway, my role I think is here to talk very frankly with you on what we've heard here in Davos because this is my second day in Davos. And what we've heard about this topic, what was the difficult, conversations with different journalists and different members of parliament, and why I think that it's not an easy discussion to have here right now, specifically when the war is still going. So first, to tell you honestly, I was studying international humanitarian law in Kiev, in Institute of International Relations, where I met actually my husband and one of my good friends, Lesya Vasilenko. And the professor who taught us international humanitarian law is right now elected a judge of the European Court of Human Rights in Passy. And well, basically, I was a big believer in international humanitarian law. And Dima, who is my husband, was not. Dima always said that there is no such thing as Geneva Conventions, it doesn't work, it's bullshit, and it was like 15 years ago, so a while before our political career. And it is always the one who has more military, who has less morals, who is, pure, non-restricted with any international law or any more morality or anything else, he will win. And I was a big believer, actually, and I stated that no, this is how international humanitarian law was developed. It was developed 300 years ago. The Geneva Conventions came up to be because this was a social contract of the world, that we need to punish those who do not comply with the rules, even if there is a war, and even if there is casus belli, there should have been rules. And Putin broke this completely for me. So for me, it was even a personal conflict, because I was such a big believer and such a, an idealist in this time. And for me, if Putin wins, it doesn't mean he will win the war, but if he wins with no responsibility from the Russian side, from the International Tribunal, from him personally, from the oligarchs that surround him, of the business circles, it will mean that actually, as Zelensky said today here in Davos, what are we talking about? Why are we talking about international humanitarian law? Why are we talking about democracy? Like, the pure force doesn't need those discussions. The pure force doesn't care. It's just using the pure force, the money, the tanks, the weapons. And what are those discussions worth if with them and with all of our belief in democracy and humanitarian law, we are not able not just to stop and prevent, we didn't do that, but even to make it pay for that, so that in the future it will not be repeated. And I was reading a lot about how the First World War came to be and the Second World War came to be. And actually, after the sign of Treaty of Versailles, Marshal Foch said that it is not a treaty of peace, it is not a signature of peace, it is just a treaty for a truce for 20 years. So he was wrong, a truce was there for about 30 years. But for me, it's horrible that we continue this circus of history, this circle that it's always a truce after the World War for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, but then we're there back again because, we didn't develop institutions, coalitions, and mechanism that would stop and prevent it in the future.
Well, we have a professor of history on stage who may want to comment on whether we're stuck in an endless cycle or whether things might be improving.
Well, I will try to be, to wrap it up, because I actually agree very much with Professor Snyder. He was today brilliant on the panel in Davos when he said that if Putin will win, it's bad for Europe and for the democratic world, not because it will mean refugees and costs and no values, but it would be because, the pure force, the hydrocarbon oligarchy you said, and the imperial, power is winning all of the democratic developments. And it would mean that, where did we come in history that we cannot not just prevent, but even punish that? So here I think that this is why this is a world problem already. It's not because it's about Ukrainian territory, it's not because it's because of values, it's not even because we cherish democracy, but it's because it will mean that to have power and to not have any boundaries and to not have any international law morals is better for you on pragmatic level, because you can win the war and you can, not even pay for this war. But here I'm being a little bit of devil's advocate, because I agree with Lena. I don't think that any reparations, and this is what Churchill said about the Second World War, so no reparations could ever compensate the cost of war, the cost of lost lives, and the cost of, of the horrible tragedy. But the reparations need to be there, and the tribunal need to be there, and any kind of responsibility need to be there for the others to see that this is not how you solve problems in the world. And in Davos, it's very difficult for us to talk about that, because we are still talking in the paradigm of Western values and Western world. And our question is, how should the world react to Russian war crimes? We know how the Western world reacts. We know how we react. But how does others react who have been actually countries of colonial past? We know that African countries, for example, see this as a completely different situation. Pakistan, who was today on a discussion with Professor Snyder, sees it as a completely different situation. So it's this horrible turn of events where Russia is fighting an imperial war on Ukraine and getting support from the countries who suffered the colonial imperial war in the past. such as Indonesia, such as South Africa, such as a lot of African countries, such as Latin America, who are voting against Ukraine in international, courts and international forums. And this is something which Russia completely destroyed in the order. And this is, I think, we should talk about how to deal with that, how to get it back to a normal reality, and how to actually make the world see, not just the Western democracy, but the world sees on what is going on here.
I mean, I agree, it's a huge problem, and it must be quite dispiriting being here in Davos and seeing the global reaction.
It's very inspiring hearing some of the people like Professor Snyder and a lot of others who has been voicing something very clearly, which we sometimes cannot say because we are very emotional and painful about that. But it was also eye-opening to hear another part of the world, and we cannot ignore that there is another part of the world that sees this as a conflict of Russia against Western democratic colonial past, while what Russia is itself bringing an imperial war, right? Russia wants to be an empire.
Tim, I invited you to sure.
Thanks. I just wanted to hear everyone out first. So if I could, just a few brief reactions. Number one, listening to the genocide discussion, I wanted to point out that some of these, there are a few other things which clarify, at least for me, that this is genocide. Genocide is also a mood, like it's a way of carrying out war. It's a kind of motivation, and that is very much present among Russian soldiers and in the Russian media today. It's a way of being. I mean, my colleague Jason Stanley wrote an article about genocide as a form of identity, and I'm afraid he's right. And I'm afraid that we're there, and we see it in the motivation, the announced motivation of how Russians behave in the field. I mean, it's a terrible way to describe it, but it's almost like it's a kind of alternative morality. Like genocide is not just the absence of something; it's the presence of something else. And I find that that's almost palpable in the sources that we have. And something I forgot to mention, which I think is also good evidence for genocidal intent, is the deliberate decoration by the president of the Russian Federation of war criminals. I mean, he's deliberately decorating the people who are not just that they are war criminals, but the people who are notorious for being war criminals. So he's affirming what you referred to, citing Professor Hastings as excess. That's being affirmed. Second thing I wanted to say, I mean, just to be clear about this, is that in pushing back a tiny bit against the cynicism here, committing war crimes doesn't mean that you're winning the war, right? It's not the same. I mean, the vicious side often loses, and that's been true of my country. We've been the more vicious side sometimes and lost wars. So it's not necessarily being more vicious which helps you to win the war. I mean, the Germans were also the more vicious side, and they ended up losing the war. So I think we have to make a distinction about that, which leads me to a third point. And I realize this is going to may seem to my Ukrainian friends very distant and abstract. But one of the reasons you prosecute, or you try to prosecute, or you talk about prosecuting, is that it defines who you are, as opposed to who the other side is. And even if it doesn't lead to a conclusion, the way that you define your norms for yourself at a critical moment will be remembered, right? So I mean, we are still 70, 80 years on almost, talking about Nuremberg and its problems, because there were lots of problems with Nuremberg, because Nuremberg is supposed to be an expression of what America was back then, right? And 80 years from now in Ukraine, students will be thinking about how you prosecuted or tried to prosecute, right? So it's not only about who they are, it's also about who you are. And then I guess the final thing I wanted to say is this point about the global South has also been very much on my mind. And, because I think that the history of Ukraine has to be understood as part of a global history of colonization, and the history of Russian Empire actually works very nicely with the general history of empire. But most people don't agree with me, and there's a lot of work to be done in that respect. And a lot of what we do in the study of Ukraine is actually what people in imperial history think of as decentering or as post-colonial history, but that's not a vocabulary which Ukrainians generally have yet, but it's pretty important. But on the legal stuff, there is a whole legal tradition, especially around the UN ruling on self-determination in 1961. There's a whole third world legal tradition which you might try to seize on. that there's a whole legal language around self-determination, which was the anti-colonial legal language, and it might pay off in this conversation for you to appropriate that, to take that over, because it does very much apply to your case, and then that speaks to a history which maybe some friends in the Global South will find more comprehensible.
I think we have another MP in the front row who'd like a brief word.
I will be very brief. The question is, how should the world react to Russian war crimes in Ukraine? I just want to hang the one question here in auditoria. What would happen if Putin would take Kiev in 4 days? There will be massive war crimes in this case, even more than now. But what would be the reaction of the world? The question. And that is, for me, shows that we have a big problem, not about Ukraine-Russia case, but in general, how can the world react and prosecute such events? And I see that we have a very big lack. We have a very big problem with the instruments. We don't have them. With all this discussion, just remember, for Putin, it's not the first genocide and war crimes. Chechnya, Syria, a lot of war crimes. And I think Chechnya can be considered also as a genocide. And unborn Chechen boys in 2000 now are killing Ukrainians in Ukraine, because that was not punished at that time, that was not stopped. So that is, for me, the question. And one practical, that was a big question, a very small question. We are saying about other countries, meaning China, I don't know, any other countries. But I have a question about the United Kingdom. One of the biggest, I absolutely appreciate the leadership of the United Kingdom in supporting of Ukraine. Now we have a practical question about Chelsea Football Club. Because that will be, we are saying about victims, where will they receive compensations? If people like Abramovich will cover their money now, when they have a deal of 4.2 billion pounds, 2.5 to some charity which still not exists, 1.6 to his pocket through Cyprus company, and 0.1 as a golden handshake to his surroundings. Is it the way how the world should react on Russia war crimes? Thank you.
Well, I haven't been paying much attention to the sale of Chelsea, but as I understand it, one of the reasons it's struggling to go through is precisely those issues as to where we'll see. Yeah, exactly. But I think, yeah. Please, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Taras Kachka. I was in legal team and still some partially in legal team on our cases against Russia. I think that there is one simple reply you actually presented here. So how we should react to war crimes, to react with justice. So that this is the core element, because this is our approach. We want justice, and all cases on genocide, on war crimes are unique in modern history. But what is interesting is that international law is not made by MPs, it is made by law professors. So Raphael Lemkin was professor when he presented his concept of genocide, and now all the best advocates in international courts are actually professors. They are from scholars. So this is, we need to have an understanding of intellectual concept of punishment, how Russia should be punished for its crimes as a state, as officials, particular executors, etc. And then when diplomatic world will support this intellectual idea, and now we see that intellectually there is an understanding that Russia should be punished. It should be supported by position of national states, and this is what happens in Vilnius, in this conference on the eventual tribunal. It is as well very visible by statements of nations in the UN, because this is clear now that every statement of all who supports us starts with clear statements that Russia violates almost every possible rule of international law. And national position is the basic source of international law. And the fact that 40 states actually expressed their willingness to join us, our side in our case against Russia, in this current case on genocide, despite the fact that it is actually legal theory behind this is like reversible. So we try to say that Russia cannot talk about genocide in Donbass by legitimizing its action. So it's otherwise, but this is a very specific question. So we see that now our willingness to react with justice actually has intellectual support in legal community among law professors and has support in diplomatic world, and it means that this idea has future. But then the last element is that whatever legal tool we will use, international justice is the most conservative legal procedure, most conservative. What we failed in the MH17 case is that we failed to prove at certain stage the intentional actions of Russian Federation, and then it took us another years and years of collecting evidences to do this. So that's why we need to collect all this data with as precision as possible and to be as patient as possible in terms of pursuing this justice, because this is the most conservative justice. But we have all these elements of actually developing unique legal instruments of punishing Russia. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Just, I'll come to you in a second. Just one thought on, Tim was talking about how you try and turn this debate on the global south around. I mean, one thing that struck me is that one of the reasons that a lot of African countries have soured on the ICC is the argument that only Africans are being prosecuted there. So if you could make the case, well, actually, this is an example of a war crime which doesn't, sort of takes the racial element out of it. You can say actually has some white people being prosecuted. Anyway, the lady here.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kira Rudik, also member of Ukrainian Parliament, leader of the Liberal Party Holos. Mr. Snyder, I have read and listened carefully to your interview with Ezra Klein, and I have a question. So you made a very, very specific point that we as humanity are tend to direct our attention to the things that are understandable for us, that are easy for us, that we do realize, like, okay, why the NATO is not expanding, or what are the complications of the climate. In terms of how the world should react, what is our blind spot, what we are not seeing? You mentioned that we should look at the point that we are turning our faces off. So today we talked about everything. I don't think that we disagree on pieces here. We do understand that Russia wouldn't pay unless it's forced to. We do understand that they will not change their habit of using force against the democracy. We do understand that the harm that is caused to Ukrainians people cannot be repaid. We need to acknowledge that it cannot be repaid for. But what are we missing? What is the missing point here? Like, what are we turning our heads? Where we are closing our eyes at? Very interested to hear your opinion.
I mean, that's a tough one, because you're asking me what is the thing that I'm not seeing. And it's much easier to say what other people aren't seeing. I'm going to use this as an opportunity to suggest that the previous remark about Chelsea is actually goes to a broader problem, which where my country and Great Britain are also quite central, especially individual states of my country, namely dark money, right? So the problem that Chelsea and Abramovich, that's just one instance of a larger problem, and it's a problem which only, American legislation and British legislation need to be trying to solve. And we see now how it's directly connected to places we wouldn't have thought it was connected to, namely war crimes prosecutions, right? So if you can't get obscure things like, partnerships with no known owner, if you can't get that right, then you have a hard time prosecuting war crimes, it turns out. So dark money is connected to all of this, and maybe that's an example of one thing which we don't see. I'm afraid I already gave my other best examples. That was good. So the history of self-determination and third world legal theory, also that's African American legal theory, by the way, like the self-determination tradition, in which I'm sure there are people here who know more than me about. Like, there's a whole legal story there, which I think Ukrainians could with profit take up, and that's maybe something that people haven't seen. Another thing is that you prosecute to show who you are and not just who the other side is. That was one of the things that I wanted to say that maybe we don't see. Aside from that, I'm afraid you kind of have me. One thing that no one has said, which is that it's much harder to use the ICC because the United States isn't, we're not a party to it, right? Somebody should say that, so I'm going to say it, right? Like, that needs to be out there. And then another thing, a defense of something which is not quite law, but which is important. Going back to have we learned nothing from the last 80 years? I think it's not quite as bad as all that. I mean, I think that the European Union is. It's interesting that the European Union is out front of individual nation states. I find that very interesting, that the European Union itself is out front of individual member states. And that suggests to me that perhaps we have learned something, which is that that sometimes collective solutions work out better than individual solutions. And I mean, for all that Germany is making me crazy, for all that Germany is making me crazy every day with its extraordinarily self-absorbed debates about Ukraine, nevertheless, the centering of Germany within a larger legal community has made some difference, right? And I look forward, and we think broadly about how the world should react to Russian war crimes in Ukraine. That reaction need not only be a legal reaction. I mean, for me, that reaction, the sensible reaction is, it's one more reason why Ukraine belongs in the European Union, right? Because if there is a big Western legal instrument which actually makes a difference in history, it is membership in the European Union. So one of my answers, maybe that's something that people don't see. I mean, one of my answers is, well, the Europeans should react by saying that it's absolutely morally obvious that Ukraine should be a member of the European Union.
Well, we're about 10 minutes over. I could draw it to close, but I mean, if people still going strong, so we can have another 5 minutes if there are others out there who want to say something. Laurie Friedman, we've got Professor Friedman from...
Another historian. Just to add to an argument on Third World, a former student of mine, Martin Kimani, who's the Kenyan ambassador to the UN, made quite a powerful speech. And one of the points he was making is that when Africa decolonized, the OAU made a determination that existing boundaries had to be respected, because otherwise you have major conflict. So there's another part of the tradition, in addition to self-determination, indeed sometimes it can be in contradiction to self-determination, that is worth pointing out. You know, Martin's speech indicated that it's not a lost cause by any sense. Can I just make one other point just on the cost, which follows on a point Tim was making. The reason why you're getting the 40 billion whatever from the US, and there is so much support coming in, I'm afraid is partly because of the war crimes. You could see public opinion turning as Mariupol was happening, as the revelations were coming in. There has been a cost to Russia because it's shown itself for what it is as a result of this war. So although it seems that he's acting with impunity, the cost has already been immense. He would be in a far stronger military position if he wouldn't have been doing it in the first place if the genocidal impulses hadn't been there. But the fact is that if he'd just done it as a straightforward military operation, he would probably be in a far better position than the brutality with which he does. Very little consolation to many Ukrainians, but I think it's a consequence of how he's done it.
Okay.
It was mentioned here about the UN Security Council. I'm just back yesterday from New York when I had meetings with the UN Under-Secretary General Rosa Maria Di Carlo. And of course, we were discussing Russia and UN Security Council membership, the veto rights, and if something can be done, because like Russia will block all the decisions. And I think we need to talk more about preventive measures, because Mariupol, Bucha, Irpin, we could prevent it if the world would react quicker. And actually, we have realized that there is only one possible for us option to somehow overcome Russians' membership and veto right in the UN Security Council. And unfortunately, the consequences of how it can be done for world is the following. So we have food security crisis, and if there will be resolution that Ukraine will draft on the food security crisis and Russia will veto it, and as a result the whole world will have the famine, etc. And only in that moment Russia will be declared the state that acts against the whole world humanity, not against Ukraine, but actually if the whole world will have this consequence. Only in that time, like let's say any kind of actions against Russia can be taken. While of course I had also meetings in Washington last week, and we were asking congressmen on is it possible to remove Russia from Security Council, and there was concrete answer no, because no precedent should be started, and US and the other members of UN Security Council, they doesn't want even to talk about it, or like, you know, to have Russia and then like withdrawal of other states might be possible. So the first one, can we prevent but not to have it as a consequence like hunger all over the world, Africa, etc. But can anything be done before? And the second one, after all the meetings with congressmen and UN, and even we had meetings in Pentagon last week, we should clearly not separate Putin from Russian society, because they are collective Putin. Because people who come to Ukraine and rape our women, children, who kill our civilians, they are the result of brainwashing machine, but they're collective Putin. And actually, we should not think that, you know, let's remove sanctions because Russian population suffers from some economic losses. They cannot pay with their banking credit card abroad. But I think that, well, they're responsible. They have elected him. The majority of them, let's say, keep silent now or observing, or they just agree with his policy. And this is highly important, that we should not be pity, maybe. That only 11% of GDP drop in Russia is expected this year compared to 45 GDP drop in Ukraine. So this is highly important.
Okay, we probably should draw it to a close. I think the two people on the end would both like a quick word, and then we'll finish.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to comment on whether we are repeating the history all the time. I think we are repeating it, but I think we are learning faster because of a globalized world, because of the internet, because of the news spreading very fast. We were actually told that this war is the first war which is the most digitalized and online documented war in history, which spreads all over with the support of, you know, democratic institutions. So we might learn much faster. And I got the confirmation of that on my first night here in Davos. So I came to the registration point very late. Obviously, you know, everything is very far and everything was closed. So I called a taxi, an Uber, and it's Davos. So the Uber that came was a Tesla car. And it costed enormous, but okay. And so the driver turns to me and he sees my name on the application, and my name is Ukrainian and quite Russian, and he starts talking to me in Russian. And obviously for me, Russian is a native language, actually, one of my two native languages, but for me right now it's very painful and very, you know, you kind of slash like a hedgehog and you're like, please don't talk Russian to me, please talk in English. And so he stopped the car and he turned to me and he said, and this is in Davos yesterday, right? And he said, I'm from Latvia. I learned Russian in school, and I know it's painful, I'm sorry. I know exactly what you're going through, because I came to Switzerland like 20 years ago, but my grandfather was actually deported from Latvia 60 or 55 years ago to Gulag. He spent 10 years in Gulag camp. He came back to my grandmother when he was weighing 40 kilograms. He survived, and right now he is talking to me, you know, from Latvia, and crying that how come that it is repeating again, this deportation in Mariupol and in Ukraine. And it was such a shock for me that it is so globalized, that my grandparents, for example, were also deported to Gulag and came back almost by foot, right? And I know those stories. And he is a guy in Davos, a Tesla driver, in Switzerland, from Latvia, and his grandfather was also deported, and the Soviet Union never was held liable for that and never was responsible for that. So we should make sure that, you know, this never happens in any other part of the world, with, you know, never again, really never again.
I think that's probably quite a good note to end on, so we'll leave it there. Thank you all to everybody in the panel. Thanks to the audience, and thanks for letting us continue long into the evening. It was a great discussion.
спалити їх тіла. Я звертаюсь до вас від імені народу, який щоденно вшановує пам'ять загиблих. Щоденно, зранку, пам'ять загиблих мирних людей.